Hey Merfolk fans, I'm Joe. Thanks for joining me today. I'm here with a replay of a match against Infect. We see two strong opening hands. The opponent won the die roll as usual. Two Pendelhavens is a little bit awkward since it's a legendary land, but he does have a Noble Hierarch, and we see a Glistener Elf for that Infect threat. Spell Pierce to protect his guys. He's going to be able to get that blue mana off the Noble Hierarch. We see Vines of Vastwood and a Groundswell for pump. Pretty great Infect hand. Could have better lands, but at least they have some lands to get started and a Hierarch to help fix their mana. On my side, three lands, an AEther Vial, only two Merfolk, but pretty good Merfolk to have in the early game, and a Vapor Snag. So against an unknown opponent, a very nice, well-rounded hand. Always great to see AEther Vial in the opener. So the opponent's going to keep, and I'm going to keep two. Pendelhaven, we know immediately, is 99% Infect. It could possibly be Elves, but we see with the Noble Hierarch that it is in fact Infect. Okay, so for my turn, I'll open with Island into AEther Vial. Nice to have AEther Vial against Infect because it gives us the option of deploying Harbinger of the Tides at instant speed as an additional trick during combat to bounce an opponent's Glistener Elf. So there we see Pendelhaven getting Glistener Elf onto the board. Opponent not playing a second land yet. So I drew an island for the turn, not amazing. And I have to think at this point whether I want to leave mana up for Vapor Snag. But with the opponent missing his second land drop, I feel like he's a little constrained on his resources. I do have AEther Vial on 1 with Cursecatcher up. So I feel comfortable furthering my own plan at this point and putting a Lord of Atlantis onto the table. So for the opponent's turn, we see he draws an Inkmoth Nexus. Let's see which land he chooses to play this turn. See, Pendelhaven's going to buff the 1/1 Glistener Elf up to a 2/3. Plays the Inkmoth Nexus pre-combat and attacks with the Glistener Elf. He's going to get a an Exalted trigger from the Noble Hierarch, making him up to 3/4. So before damage, it looks like the opponent is going to have some effects. We see a Mutagenic Growth, paying 2 life for it, so that's fine. Gonna let that resolve, so we'll go up to 5 Infect, and let's see. So he did have Landfall. Not quite sure why he didn't use the Noble Hierarch to cast Groundswell there. I mean, it is correct with Infect to not overcommit your mana to your pump effects in case the opponent has some kind of interaction. But at this point, I was tapped out with only an AEther Vial representing Cursecatcher. If the opponent has any experience against Merfolk, he would know that if I tried to counter the Groundswell with a Cursecatcher, he'd have the mana to pay for it with Inkmoth Nexus. So opponent probably should have gone for it there with Groundswell. So here's Cursecatcher. We're going to tick our AEther Vial up to 2, and unfortunately we only draw another land. So we're having to use our resources really, really carefully this game. Mutavault has to come out this turn as a potential attacker in the coming turns. Going to swing with both of our creatures, leaving up Vapor Snag here for the Glistener Elf. We see he does have Vines of Vastwood to protect his guy, but he only has the 2 green mana to commit to that Vines of Vastwood. Opponent draws another Noble Hierarch for the turn. So he's going to use Pendelhaven number 1 to activate Inkmoth Nexus, play the second Pendelhaven, which destroys the first Pendelhaven. And now we see an attack with the Inkmoth Nexus. So in this combat, let's see, so he's getting the Exalted from Noble Hierarch, and we see he's not going to use the Pendelhaven buff here. Again, slightly inexperienced opponent, probably should have just went with the Pendelhaven buff. That's something that I can't counter or really interact with at all. So if he had used the Pendelhaven buff on Inkmoth Nexus, it would have been a 2/2 going into combat, would have become a 3/3 from Noble Hierarch, put me up to 8. And then he could have had mana up for Spell Pierce with Noble Hierarch if I tried to interact with the Inkmoth Nexus. So let's see. Other options include playing out Noble Hierarch with the Pendelhaven for an additional Exalted trigger. That would have made him into another way would have made him into a 3/3. So he could have used Pendelhaven and sort of a roundabout way to get the creature to have a higher power. I probably would have tapped Pendelhaven to play the Noble Hierarch, leave this Noble Hierarch up for Spell Pierce backup. I wouldn't have committed any of these pump spells at this point with me having 3 mana up. So opponent is attacking with the Inkmoth Nexus, leaving 2 mana up. Can no longer use Pendelhaven to target the Inkmoth Nexus because the Exalted trigger has resolved. And this Pendelhaven can only target 1/1 creatures. So I just tell him no blocks, asking if he has anything before damage. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I should talk about this. I bluffed AEther Vial here. I tapped it and asked if it was okay. Opponent thought about it and finally said sure. I told him I had nothing, and I guess he felt like the coast was clear, so he tapped out for a Vines of Vastwood. Again, a little bit strange because he has a Groundswell. And a Spell Pierce. He could have cast the Groundswell for the same buff, +4/+4, and still had blue mana up for Spell Pierce. Very strange play from the opponent. He should have had this game by all rights, but I have the Vapor Snag in, and I can bounce his guy. And even a little bit of poor play against even a poor hand from another, high-level modern deck, you can just, lose on the spot. So another Merfolk. I'm going to attack for 4. Play, another Mutavault. Tap 4 for Master of Waves. With only a Glistener Elf on the board, he's not going to be able to deal with my 5 elementals. And, well, I take that back. He drew a Dismember. So what can he do here? I'm at 5 Infect. He can play the Dismember. I'm left with no blockers. And swing with the Glistener Elf with Exalt. Well, let's see. Exalted makes him 2. I'm tapped out, so he could be playing around a Harbinger of the Tides, but I don't think this guy really knows his deck, much less my deck. So I dismember my Master of Waves with the Inkmoth Nexus. I'd be left with nobody. Swing with the Glistener Elf again for Exalted, and yeah, go for it now. Play the Groundswell, but he has no landfall, so it's only +2/+2. So he wants to get this guy up to 3 if possible. How can we do that? If let's see, if the opponent uses this for the Dismember, he can use Pendelhaven to get this guy up to a 2/3. Okay, so that's how you do it, right? Or no, I guess it works either way, right? So the opponent can tap this for the Noble Hierarch, play the Noble Hierarch, swing with double Exalted triggers. He's a 3/3 then. Noble Hierarch provides green mana for Groundswell. Only with a 2/2 buff, but he only needs 5 to get there. But I don't think the opponent saw any lines. He does play the Hierarch, and he passes. It's very strange. I think, it's just inexperience. I don't think he realizes that these elementals are sort of contingent upon Master of Waves being on the table. Maybe he's trying to surprise me during my own turn. But sort of strange. Not how you expect Infect to play. So I'm just going to turn all my guys sideways. I've got the 2 Mutavaults at this point. If I activate the 2 Mutavaults and swing with everybody, he can still dismember my Master of Waves. All these elementals go away. The Mutavaults are only 3/3s. He can certainly block if he wanted to. The opponent did scoop. Certainly didn't have to. So I guess this particular replay is just an example of how not to play Infect. Okay, so I have a great hand, and let's look at this. The opponent has only Inkmoth Nexus as mana. Tricky. He does have Noble Hierarch if he hits any green. He has his mana online, but I think it's probably mulligan. So they mulligan again to 6, and then to 5. But it's a great 5. We see 2 lands, Hierarch, Glistener Elf, Vines. He does have Pendelhaven as a pump effect. He scries and puts Breeding Pool onto the bottom of his library. We see the turn 1 Glistener Elf, can't ask for much more, but I unfortunately have AEther Vial, Tidebinder Mage, Harbinger, tons of interaction, Spreading Seas if he draws any Inkmoth Nexuses. Pretty terrible draw in Spellskite. Opponent's going to play the Noble Hierarch, buff the Glistener Elf, I'll take 3 Infect, go to my upkeep, take AEther Vial up to 1, drew a Merrow Reejerey for the turn. I'm going to play Tidebinder, locking down his only threat. Opponent had Vines in hand, but with no mana available. Again, potentially a bit of inexperience showing there. He probably should have just played the Hierarch and swung for 2, leaving his mana up for Vines to give his Glistener Elf hexproof around any effects that I might cast. I could have drawn a Vapor Snag or a Dismember or a Tidebinder Mage. So as it went, the opponent's green Glistener Elf being locked down by the Tidebinder Mage. See 2 pump spells now and a Spellskite in the hand. Pretty terrible. He's going to pass back to me. AEther Vial will go up to 2. And I'm sitting about as pretty as you could hope against Infect. He did mulligan to 5. But with a non-interactive Merfolk hand, this could possibly have gotten there with smart play. The hand had everything that Infect wants. It had an Infect creature. It had a couple sources of pump. It had Pendelhaven, Noble Hierarch for extra Exalted and mana fixing, and Spellskite to protect the attacker. But opponent let his guard down, and I locked down the attacker, and things are just going to spiral out of control pretty quickly, I think. So add the Lord, swing for 4. The clock is ticking, and the opponent just scooped it up. So a very quick match against Infect. The previous game, the first one in the match, should almost certainly have gone to the Infect player, but poor play let me steal it from him, and then the mulligan cost him the second game, though a bit of poor play contributed to it. So, yeah, that's it. Please leave any comments you might have, and I'll see you guys next time.